In March 2003, as cruise missiles struck Baghdad and tanks crossed the Kuwaiti border, the U.S. military launched Operation Iraqi Freedom. The mission was clear: remove Saddam Hussein from power. And the official justification? Iraq was said to be hiding weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, that posed an immediate threat. But here's the thing: those weapons were never found. The campaign began with an air assault on Baghdad, followed by a rapid ground invasion. At first, it seemed like a swift victory. In just 3 weeks, Saddam's regime collapsed, and President George W. Bush famously declared mission accomplished from the deck of an aircraft carrier. However, the situation quickly became more complex. Iraq's army was disbanded, and many members of the former ruling party were barred from government jobs. This created a power vacuum and widespread unrest. An insurgency emerged, and fighting between different groups escalated in several parts of the country. Over the following years, violence continued. American and coalition troops remained in Iraq until 2011. By the time U.S. combat forces withdrew, over 4,000 American troops and possibly hundreds of thousands Iraqi civilians had lost their lives. The war also displaced millions and left much of the country's infrastructure in ruins. The financial cost of the war was staggering. Estimates range from $1 to $2 trillion, depending on how you count long-term veterans care. Internationally, Operation Iraqi Freedom became a source of controversy, and even today, many view the operation as a turning point in global politics, with effects still visible in the region's politics and security. This next one started with oil. In 1951, Iran's Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, did something bold. He nationalized the country's oil industry, kicking out British control and reclaiming resources for the Iranian people. To many Iranians, this was a patriotic act. To the British, it was something different, a crisis. So the British government turned to its ally, the United States, and behind closed doors, the CIA and MI6 devised a secret plan, Operation Ajax, a covert coup to remove Mossadegh and reinstall the Shah, a monarch who was far more friendly to Western interests. The CIA spread propaganda in Iranian newspapers, paid off mob leaders, and bribed politicians and military officers. After weeks of unrest and staged violence, the Shah returned to power, and Mossadegh was arrested. At the time, the operation was seen in Washington and London as a success. But the long-term effects were explosive. The Shah's regime became increasingly authoritarian, relying on secret police and violent crackdowns to stay in power. For 26 years, resentment simmered under the surface, until it erupted in the 1979 Islamic Revolution, which overthrew the Shah and transformed Iran into a theocratic state deeply hostile to the West. Iranian leaders still reference 1953 when speaking about foreign interference. The operation itself remained classified for decades. It wasn't until the 2000s that the CIA officially acknowledged its role. In the 1970s, a secret alliance was formed between several military governments in South America. The goal was to suppress political opposition, not just with their own borders, but across the region. This operation became known as Operation Condor. The governments involved included Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, Paraguay, Bolivia, and Brazil. Each of these countries was under military rule, and all were engaged in internal crackdowns against left-wing movements, labor organizers, students, exiles, and anyone considered a threat to the regime. What made Condor different was its level of coordination. Through shared intelligence and cooperation between security forces, these regimes tracked, abducted, interrogated, and took out political opponents, even those who had fled to neighboring countries. In many cases, people were kidnapped abroad, transported secretly, and handed over to authorities in their country of origin. The program operated through a network of clandestine detention centers, and relied on methods that included harsh treatment, long-term imprisonment without trial, and extrajudicial executions. Some victims were taken from the streets in broad daylight, and many were never seen again. Evidence later emerged that the United States government was aware of Operation Condor as it unfolded. Declassified documents show that U.S. intelligence agencies had knowledge of the program's activities and maintained ties with officials in several of the participating countries. The extent of U.S. involvement remains debated, but the documentation confirms that the operation was not unknown to foreign allies. In March 1969, the United States began a secret bombing campaign in Cambodia, a country that was officially neutral during the Vietnam War. The operation was called Menu, and its goal was to target North Vietnamese troops and Viet Cong supply routes that were believed to be operating just across the border. The airstrikes were ordered by President Richard Nixon shortly after taking office. The campaign was divided into phases with code names like breakfast, lunch, and dinner, giving the mission its nickname. Over the course of 14 months, American B-52 bombers dropped more than 100,000 tons of explosives on eastern Cambodia. The bombings were conducted in secret, not just from the public, but also from most members of Congress. Flight logs were falsified, official records were altered, and briefings excluded direct references to Cambodia. For more than a year, the American public and much of the U.S. government had no idea it was happening. When the operation was finally exposed in 1970, it sparked immediate backlash. Members of Congress accused the Nixon administration of bypassing constitutional limits on the use of military force. The bombings had significant impact on Cambodia itself. The eastern provinces were heavily damaged, and thousands of civilians lost their lives. Survivors were displaced, and local communities were torn apart. As villages were destroyed and political stability weakened, the Khmer Rouge, a radical communist movement, began to grow in power. In the years that followed, they would launch a full-scale revolution and take control of the country. On December 27, 2008, the Israeli military launched a large-scale offensive in the Gaza Strip. The operation was called Cast Lead, and its stated objective was to stop rocket fire from Hamas and other military groups targeting southern Israel. The operation began with a series of airstrikes across Gaza. Within minutes, Israeli aircraft hit dozens of targets, including Hamas police stations, storage sites, and known militant positions. Ground forces entered the territory a week later, leading to direct clashes in urban areas. The conflict lasted 22 days. By the time the fighting ended, more than 1,400 Palestinians had lost their lives, including a significant number of civilians. On the Israeli side, 13 people were lost, 3 of them civilians. The infrastructure damage in Gaza was extensive. Homes, schools, hospitals, and government buildings were destroyed or severely damaged. The Israeli government stated it had taken precautions to minimize civilian casualties, including dropping leaflets and making phone calls to warn residents before airstrikes. However, multiple international organizations, including the United Nations, later raised concerns about the scale of destruction and the use of force in densely populated areas. One of the most disputed elements of the operation was the reported use of white phosphorus, a substance that can be used legally as a smokescreen, but is highly controversial when deployed in civilian zones. Its use in Gaza drew international condemnation and raised questions about adherence to the laws of armed conflict. During the Vietnam War, the United States launched a covert program known as Operation Phoenix. The goal was to identify and dismantle the Viet Cong's political infrastructure, the network of informants, recruiters, and organizers operating inside South Vietnam. The program was led by the CIA, with support from U.S. military intelligence and South Vietnamese security forces. Its primary method was targeted counterinsurgency, locate suspected Viet Cong operatives, and either capture, interrogate, or eliminate them. To do this, officials built extensive intelligence files, relying on local informants, surveillance, and captured documents. Armed teams were then sent to act on that information. From 1968 to 1972, an estimated 80,000 individuals were detained or placed under investigation. Of those, around 26 to 41,000 lost their lives during operations. Some were confirmed Viet Cong operatives. Others were civilians caught up in faulty intelligence, political rivalries, or mistaken identity. Suspects were often arrested without formal charges, held in secret facilities, and subjected to interrogation methods that included physical coercion. In some cases, local officials used the program to settle personal or political scores. By 1972, the program was gradually phased out and absorbed into other intelligence operations. In June 1984, the Indian government launched a military operation known as Operation Blue Star. The target was the Golden Temple complex in Amritsar, the holiest site in Sikhism. Inside the temple, a group of heavily armed Sikh militants, led by Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale, had fortified the complex. The group had called for greater autonomy for Punjab and had been involved in violent clashes with government forces in the months leading up to the operation. The Indian government, under Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, ordered the military to remove the militants. The operation began on June 3rd, with security forces surrounding the temple. On June 5th, the Indian Army entered the complex. What followed was intense close-quarters fighting between troops and the militants inside. The army used tanks, artillery, and infantry units to clear the buildings. By the end of the assault, Bhindranwale and many of his followers were no longer living. Official estimates place the total number of lives lost at several hundred, though independent reports suggest the number may have been much higher. Among those who lost their lives were civilians, including pilgrims who had been present in the temple during the fighting. The Akal Takht, a key religious structure within the complex, was heavily damaged during the battle. This caused widespread anger among Sikhs in India and abroad. Many viewed the assault as an attack not just on militants but on their faith itself. In October 2001, less than a month after the September 11th attacks, the United States launched Operation Enduring Freedom. The mission began as a military campaign to remove the Taliban from power in Afghanistan and to disrupt and dismantle al-Qaeda. The operation started with targeting airstrikes and support for Afghan opposition groups. Within weeks, Taliban forces withdrew from several key cities, and a new interim government was installed in Kabul. But while the initial phase moved quickly, the broader mission soon expanded. What began as a counter-terrorism operation evolved into a long-term effort at nation-building, involving U.S. and NATO forces, reconstruction projects, and the training of Afghan military and police. The conflict continued for more than a decade. During that time, the Taliban regrouped in rural areas and across the border in Pakistan. Insurgent attacks increased, especially in the southern provinces, and large parts of the country remained unstable. The U.S. also shifted focus at times, particularly after the invasion of Iraq in 2003, dividing military and intelligence resources between two ongoing wars. Between 2001 and 2014, an estimated 110 to 170,000 people lost their lives, including over 2,300 American troops, more than 450 British troops, and a large number of Afghan civilians and security personnel. Many regions saw repeated cycles of combat, followed by withdrawal, followed by renewed Taliban activity. Financially, the war was one of the most expensive in U.S. history. Estimates vary, but the total cost, including veterans' care, aid, and long-term support, may exceed $2 trillion. In December 2014, the U.S. formally ended Operation Enduring Freedom and transitioned to a new mission focused on advising Afghan forces. However, combat operations continued under a different name, and U.S. troops remained in the country until August 2021, when the last American forces withdrew during the final days of the war. Operation Enduring Freedom was the longest-running U.S. military campaign at the time. In 1972, following the Munich Olympic attack, in which 11 Israeli athletes lost their lives by the Palestinian group Black September, the Israeli government launched a covert response known as Operation Wrath of God. The operation was authorized by Prime Minister Golda Meir and carried out by Mossad, Israel's national intelligence agency. The goal was to track down and eliminate individuals believed to have played a role in the planning or execution of the Munich attack. Teams of Mossad operatives were sent across Europe and the Middle East. They used a combination of surveillance, forged passports, and coordination with local contacts to locate their targets. Over the course of the operation, suspected members of Black September and affiliated organizations were taken out in cities such as Beirut, Paris, Athens, Rome, and Nicosia. One of the most publicized events of the campaign was a mistaken killing. In 1973, a Mossad team in Lillehammer, Norway, shot and ended the life of a Moroccan waiter who was incorrectly identified as a Black September member. Several agents were arrested by Norwegian authorities, and the incident brought international attention to the operation. Despite that setback, the campaign continued for years. Some of the attacks were carried out by explosives, others with firearms at close range. In many cases, there were no public claims of responsibility. Israel has never officially confirmed the full extent of the operation, and the exact number of people affected remains uncertain. Estimates vary, but over a dozen individuals were reportedly targeted and taken out. Some accounts suggest a broader list was created, with operations continuing into the late 1980s. Following the end of World War II, Western intelligence agencies began preparing for the possibility of a Soviet invasion in Western Europe. One result was Operation Gladio, a covert program to establish stay-behind networks across several NATO countries. These secret units were trained, supplied, and funded with the intention of resisting occupation in the event of a Warsaw Pact invasion. They were composed of selected individuals who could operate underground, sabotage infrastructure, gather intelligence, and support local resistance movements if necessary. The operation was coordinated by the CIA, MI6, and other Western intelligence services, in cooperation with domestic agencies across Western Europe. Each participating country ran its own version of the program, but they shared information and guidance through NATO's military planning structures. For many years, the existence of Operation Gladio was unknown to the public. That changed in 1990, when Italian Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti publicly confirmed the program's existence before Parliament. In Italy, Gladio had become the subject of parliamentary investigations after suspicions that elements of the network may have been involved in domestic political violence during the 1970s and 1980s. Similar disclosures followed in France, Belgium, Germany, Greece, and other countries. In some cases, former operatives and intelligence officials testified that their networks had remained active even without a Soviet threat, raising concerns about whether Gladio units had played a role in false flag attacks, anti-communist activities, or unauthorized surveillance of domestic political groups. The exact extent of those activities remains disputed. On December 20, 1989, the United States launched Operation Just Cause, a military invasion of Panama. The stated goal was to remove Manuel Noriega from power. Noriega, the country's military leader, had previously cooperated with U.S. intelligence, but had become increasingly uncooperative and was later indicted in the United States on drug trafficking charges. Tensions had been escalating for months. The U.S. accused Noriega of undermining democratic elections, harassing American personnel, and turning Panama into a base for criminal activity. After a U.S. Marine lost his life in Panama City in mid-December, President George H.W. Bush authorized military action. The invasion involved more than 27,000 U.S. troops, supported by aircraft, armored vehicles, and special operations forces. Within hours, key military targets in Panama City were struck, and U.S. forces gained control of strategic locations across the country. Noriega fled and sought refuge in the Vatican Embassy, where he remained for several days before surrendering in early January 1990. He was then brought to the United States to stand trial. The operation was militarily successful, and the Panamanian Defense Forces were quickly dismantled. A new government, previously elected but prevented from taking office by Noriega, was installed with U.S. backing. However, the operation drew criticism both internationally and within the U.S. The United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution calling the invasion a violation of international law. Civilian areas in Panama City were heavily affected, where fighting and fires caused widespread destruction. Estimates of civilian losses vary, but most place the number between 300 and 500, with thousands more displaced. The U.S. military reported 23 American service members had lost their lives. Manuel Noriega was later convicted in U.S. court and sentenced to prison. He remained incarcerated in multiple countries for nearly 3 decades before his passing in 2017. In July 2014, the Israeli military launched Operation Protective Edge, a large-scale campaign in the Gaza Strip. The stated objective was to stop rocket attacks by Hamas and other armed groups targeting southern Israel, and to dismantle a network of tunnels used to move fighters and weapons across the border. The operation began with airstrikes on known and suspected militant positions, followed by a ground invasion on July 17th. Over the course of 50 days, Israeli forces carried out thousands of airstrikes, artillery shellings, and raids, while Hamas and other groups launched rockets into Israeli cities, including Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. By the time a ceasefire was declared in late August, more than 2,100 Palestinians had lost their lives, according to United Nations estimates. A significant number of those were civilians. On the Israeli side, 67 soldiers and 6 civilians lost their lives, and hundreds more were wounded. Homes, hospitals, schools, and critical infrastructure in Gaza were damaged or destroyed during the fighting. The Israeli government stated that it took steps to reduce civilian harm, including warning residents before strikes and targeting only military objectives. However, several international organizations, including the United Nations Human Rights Council, raised concerns about the proportionality of force and the use of heavy weapons in densely populated areas. One of the central points of contention was the use of civilian areas by Hamas. Israeli officials argued that fighters launched attacks from schools, mosques, and residential neighborhoods, placing civilians at risk. The war displaced over 100,000 people in Gaza, and the damage to infrastructure led to long-term shortages of water, electricity, and medical supplies. Although the fighting ended with a ceasefire, the conditions that led to the conflict remained unresolved. Thank you for watching the video and making it to the end. I hope you learned something and found it interesting. If you did, please give us a like. So, what's your take on these operations? Were they necessary? Do you find them controversial? I'd love to hear your takes on it. There should be another video about military action on your screen right now, so please check that out. And subscribe to see more content from this channel in the future. Thanks again. See you next time.